Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delicat. Thanks so much for being with us this afternoon as we continue the Law and Crime Rewind. Today, our theme is The Victim Speaks. We are revisiting some of the top trials of the past year where we heard emotional testimony from victims of the crimes. First, we're going to kick it off with Quincinio Canada and Dewan Malazem. You may recall they were charged with murdering Marine Jonathan Price. The crime actually happened back in 2014, but the trial was this summer. Then later today, we're going to be moving on to the trial of Cody Lott. He was charged with killing a young 13-year-old girl, although another 13-year-old girl survived, and she gave emotional testimony about what she experienced. And then later today, we'll be taking you through the highlights of the Sean Great trial. You may remember that was a particularly horrific one in which Sean Great held a woman captive in his home, abused her, and she was only able to escape when she managed to call 911 while Great was sleeping next to her. Police arrived to the house to find not only her, but several other dead bodies. These were some really compelling trials, lots of great moments that we want to get back to and recap as we continue this Law and Crime Rewind. So let's kick it off with the Marine murder trial out of Kentucky, and we'll start first with the victim's 911 call. Now, the surviving victim is Jonathan Price's wife, Megan Price. The two had been married less than a year when in 2014 they were at a bar in their Kentucky town. They were waiting outside the bar, talking, hanging out, waiting for a ride when two men approached them. One of the men tried to steal Megan's purse. Jonathan Price, her husband, intervened, tried to get the guys to back off. Another guy drew a gun, shot him in the back, and shot Megan in the leg. Jonathan Price was unresponsive when first responders arrived to the scene. Megan, as I said, was shot in the leg. She made an emotional, very fearful, as you might imagine, 911 call to police, urging them to get there as soon as possible. During the call, you will hear her say, "Jonathan, I love you." Let's kick it off with that 911 call.
Where are you? What is your name? Megan Price. And did you see who did it, Megan? Two black guys. Did they leave in a car or on foot? On foot. I can't move my leg. It's not my leg. Is there anything you can remember about them? Two black men. That's all? Did you see the guns? Both had guns. One had dreadlocks. White shirt. Which one? No. The one that shot me. Looked at my husband into the truck, into a truck. Jonathan, I love you. Jonathan, I love you. Jonathan! Where was he shot at, ma'am? I don't know. I can't get to him. I can't get to him. Help me. Wait, just stay on the phone with me, okay? I'm going to get you when we get there. They're all on the way.
Well, a very emotional 911 call as Megan Price called police to the scene saying her husband had been shot, and we hear her yelling to her husband, who is laying on the ground after being shot, "I love you, Jonathan. I love you, Jonathan." Tearful and very heartbroken, and I'm sure shocked as well. Well, Megan Price was shot in her leg, but she did recover, and 4 years after this shooting happened, the trial finally got underway this summer, and Megan took the stand to recount what she remembers from that night. She was asked by prosecutors, "Do you remember that night?" And she said, "Every day." Let's listen now as she walked through what happened on that fateful night.
Process. It was both. It's to a red truck.
Next to the red truck?
A red truck, yes.
Okay. And do you know if he was standing on the ground?
He was on the ground.
He was on the ground when he got shot.
One of the two men bent down and took Jonathan's wallet out of his back pocket, and they took off away from the bar.
Do you remember who did that? Which one did that?
White shirt.
Which shirt? And do you know what was happening with the other person? Could you see him while you were there on the ground?
He was walking away.
Walking away.
I tried to get to Jonathan and I couldn't.
And why couldn't you?
Because I had been shot.
Where were you shot?
My left leg.
Well, that was Megan Price on the stand over the summer in the trial against her husband's accused killers. We will not talk about the verdict just yet, but as we just heard Megan on the stand talk about that night, she and her husband, who was just 26 years old, a Marine, and remember, as I said, they had only been married less than a year, were outside this bar when these two men approached. She just walked us through what happened, her husband being shot, she being shot in the leg and how she fell to the ground when that happened, and seeing these men take her purse, take her husband's wallet out of his pocket, and take off. Joining me now is our very own Vincent Hill, Law and Crime Zone and law enforcement expert. Vincent, thanks as always for joining me this afternoon.
Always a pleasure, Stacey.
So, before we get into this specific testimony, let's just talk for a minute about what it means for a trial when we have a surviving witness. So many trials we cover, there was no witness except perhaps the suspect themselves in a murder trial.
Right.
So, how important is it and how much of an asset is it to the prosecution when we have someone who was there at the scene to recount what they saw?
Well, Stacey, I think it's the biggest asset for the prosecution because you can take those emotions that Megan was just showing, you can show that to the jury. She can tell you about her story. She can tell you about the events of that night. It was her birthday. They were out celebrating her birthday. Her husband, who is a hero, a Marine, was not shot and killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, defending the freedoms of this country. He was shot and killed protecting his wife, who was able to take the stand and tell that story. So that is huge for the prosecution's safety.
Now, what did you make of her testimony so far? We're going to watch a lot more, but obviously, she lost her husband. She's a widow. She's quite emotional. Do you think that so far what we have seen will be effective in swaying the jury?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so because she's the only person that can actually tell this story, right? We can't obviously rely on the suspects in this accused murder here because they're not going to tell a complete story. They're only going to tell their side of the story. But when you have the victim who saw her husband just feet away, and you heard in that call, I couldn't get to him. I can't get to him. When you heard in that call, I think for the jury, that is huge, and I think it will weigh heavy on their decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if this were just the testimony, we would say, wow. But it goes on. We're going to watch some more next. And what's a little bit interesting in this case is that, well, of course, Megan was there. She was emotional. She was understandably focused on her husband and I'm sure her own gunshot wound. Things get a little bit more fuzzy when it comes to identifying the suspects in this case. We know in the courtroom that she has Quincinio Canada and Dewan Malazim sitting right in front of her there. Will she positively identify them? Let's go ahead and take a listen.
And Steve.
And did you talk to them about what had occurred?
I did, yes.
Did you also give them a description of the people that were involved?
I did.
Is that the description that you talked about here today?
Yes.
Were you ever, did you ever do a photo lineup?
I did not.
Why not?
I did not want to be responsible for making the wrong choice.
So Megan Price was asked, did you identify the killers, your husband's killers? And she said, I did not, because I didn't want to be responsible for making a mistake. Vincent, what can we make of that? Usually we would, say a victim, hear a victim say, he's the one who did it, he's the one who did it, she's the one who did it, and positively, identify the killer in this case. Now, she's talking about identifying, of course, the suspects years ago when the killing happened, but this is definitely a bit of a problem, I would think, for prosecutors, that she did not positively identify them.
Absolutely. It's definitely a blow to the prosecution, but I commend her for her courage. It's the courage to say, yes, I can't tell you for 100% certainty what you need in a lineup. You can't say, well, it looks like the guy, it could be the guy, his hair's the same. You have to say with 100% certainty that this is the individual. So she was actually very brave in saying she can't identify this person. Now, of course, defense, if I was a defense attorney, I would jump all over this, Stacey, to say, well, how do we know we have the right person? We're in Louisville. There's a lot of black males with cornrows in their hair who fit this description, average size, average build. How do we know my client is the person that shot your husband?
Absolutely. I mean, we know the defense does take advantage of this, and they go on to really try to drive home the point that this was perhaps a case of mistaken identity, and they talk about that through DNA evidence as well. We're going to get to that. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot more to this story than just the shooting at the bar that fateful night. The suspects on trial here are actually alleged to be involved in a robbery weeks before this shooting. One of the guns that was stolen, the same gun used to kill Jonathan Price. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Then when he came in the room, you said the other person had a hoodie on. At some point in the room, did that hoodie stay on his head?
I don't think it ever come off. It pulled back. It wasn't. When he was walking down there, it's kind of pulled all the way, from his face. So once he was inside, it was pulled more.
Okay. And then did you notice anything else about him once that hoodie kind of pulled back a little bit?
Because of the dreads. A large nose.
Dreads and a large nose. Okay. So then you said that this person here is the one that said, come on, nephew. And that's the one that had the gun to your head. And then what happened after they said that?
What happened?
And did you see what direction they went?
It looked like they made it right. I wouldn't swear to it because the door shuts itself.
Mm-hmm. But you think that they made it right and went back down?
Yeah.
But back to town?
Yeah, back down the wall, the sidewalk, I guess. From the direction that they came.
Okay. And what items were taken? You talked about the wallet outside. And what was taken inside that belonged to you?
The cell phone, my handgun, which is wallet.
So some very key moments in that testimony there. We, first of all, heard him identify one of the suspects, say that that was definitely him. And we also heard Shane Hemsworth say that he heard Malazem say to Canada, come on, nephew. That's a point the prosecutors are going to play up as this trial continues, because Malazem and Canada consider themselves uncle and nephew. Whether it's a blood relation or just sort of one that's formed over time. We're going to talk about both of those points in a second, but first let's continue and listen to a little bit more of what Shane Hemsworth had to say.
This instruction to you, and then what did he do?
Handed me that and said, do I recognize anybody in the photo?
Okay, so handed it to you and asked if you recognize anybody in that photo. Mm-hmm. And other than that, did he say anything else to you?
No.
Okay. Do you recognize that photo as the one that he showed you?
I do.
Do you recognize anyone in that photo?
I do.
And who do you recognize?
Number 5.
Okay. And this picture right here, number 5. Mm-hmm. All right. And who do you recognize that person to be?
The man sitting right there.
Okay. And then that man sitting there, is that the one that robbed you at the Quality Inn?
He is.
On the bottom of the form, did you tell them Detective Upchurch number 5?
I did.
Did he ask you to write something on this form?
He did.
And what did he tell you to write?
Whatever I felt.
All right. And do you remember, I'm going to show you that now, do you remember what you wrote?
I did.
And what did you say?
The longer I look at the photos, number 5 is who I feel robbed me.
Okay. Tell us what you mean by that.
You get this sick feeling in your stomach when you go through something like this. It's indescribable, but to this day, I mean, it's been 4 years. I can look at that photo and I still get sick in my stomach. It wasn't pleasant.
Okay. And so when you're saying the longer I look at it, the more that I feel that he's the one that robbed me, are you unsure about that at all? The way that it's written, are you unsure about that?
No, I'm 100% sure.
Okay.
There's no doubt about it.
I'm 100% sure, says Shane Hemsworth, that the man who robbed him is the one that the prosecutor showed him pictured and is sitting there in that courtroom. He had some pretty strong statements there. He said even 4 years after this robbery, it still gives him a sick feeling in his stomach to look at the suspect's photo. He says it's undescribable when something like this happens to you. So Vincent Hill, our Law&Crime host and law enforcement expert, still with me via Skype. So Vincent, here we do have some pretty compelling testimony as he positively identifies one of the suspects as the man who robbed him. That certainly helps for the charges for this robbery.
Yeah, absolutely, but we're still not there for the murder of Jonathan Price. And one of the problems I saw during his testimony is he said when he was talking to the detective, when he was writing his statement, the more I look at this picture, it looks like the guy that robbed me, and now he's saying he's 100% sure this is the guy that robbed him. But of course, anytime you're dealing with a traumatic event, sometimes you have to replay it in your mind. So that could be why he made that statement. But again, from a defense standpoint, I would just key in on that to say, well, again, you said this could look like, it looks like the guy that robbed you. We're still not at 100% when you gave that statement to investigators.
Yeah, and the point you raise, of course, that this does nothing for the murder charge. Now, the link prosecutors are trying to make here is that the gun used to kill Jonathan Price matched the serial number of a gun stolen at that Quality Inn motel from Shane Hemsworth and the friends he was with 6 days prior. The suspects are also on trial for that robbery. So while his Shane Hemsworth's testimony, I would say, probably does maybe help a little bit, although he did waffle back and forth, as you mentioned, it does nothing really in the murder charge. So, you know, for that, this is almost irrelevant to the murder. It is, really.
Yeah, absolutely. But to your point, if they can link the gun that was stolen during that robbery to the actual murder of Jonathan Price, we know this individual testified that it was his gun that was stolen. The serial number matched. Ballistics later matched to that gun. If prosecutors are able to tie that, Stacey, then they may be onto something in this murder trial against these two defendants.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Great point there, Vincent. And we will see how that connection comes together as this trial continued. First, going to take a quick break. We'll be back with much more from the Marine murder trial. Stay with us. Welcome back to Law and Crime as we continue on our rewind of trials in which the victims speak. We talk about the Marine murder trial from over the summer, a trial about the murder of Marine Jonathan Price, who was shot and killed outside a bar in Lexington, Kentucky back in 2014. His wife, who you see there in that photo, Megan Price, was there. She also was shot, but shot in the leg, and she survived to tell her story. Earlier in the hour, we heard some of her emotional testimony as well as the emotional 911 call she made to police right after she had been shot. But as we've been saying, this is not the only part of the story, because 6 days before Jonathan Price was shot and killed, prosecutors allege the two men charged in his murder robbed a number of people who were outside a hotel room at the Quality Inn nearby. Those folks were in town for a gun show, and the prosecutors allege that Malazem and Canada stole several guns as well as cash and took off. The key point here is that one of the guns that was stolen from the hotel room, prosecutors allege, was the gun that was used to kill Jonathan Price. We just heard from Shane Hemsworth, one of the victims, who was able to positively identify one of the suspects, saying he is 100% sure that that is the man who held him up at gunpoint and stole his belongings. But as I mentioned, there were a number of people outside the hotel room on that day. Mitchell Smith is another one of him. His identification of the suspects, not as solid. Let's go ahead and listen.
So who was going around the room looking for things?
This guy here.
Okay. What was the other person doing?
He was standing at the door keeping watch.
And what do you mean when you said keeping watch?
Making sure nobody was coming and we wasn't going to get up and make a move.
Okay. How was he doing that?
He was just standing there with his gun.
Okay.
He told me to lay on the bed, but besides that, the only thing he said to me, I was telling him, please don't shoot me, and he said, it's going to be okay.
Did you take that as comforting?
Not really.
Okay.
It felt like a derogative statement, you know, just something to shut you up.
Okay. So did you lay down on the bed?
Yeah.
All right. And could you see what was going on while you were laying down?
Yeah, I laid on my stomach with my head up.
Okay. What's going on while you're laying on the bed?
He kept going through things. He picked up the holster for the .45. He went to the other side of Shane and Jess's bed and picked up a backpack. And I'm not sure if he went through it or not. Then he walked back between the beds where the entertainment center was against the wall, picked up a set of keys, and this guy right here said, come on, nephew, and they left.
Well, that was Mitchell Smith recounting the details of the armed robbery of which he was a victim at the Quality Inn Motel back in 2014 in Lexington, Kentucky. So what does he say about the two men on trial, Quincinio Canada and Dewan Malazem? Let's go ahead and listen.
Just one. I'm going to have a couple follow-ups, but one specifically. Having seen that person over there in the green with the hair, dreadlocks, is that the individual with the dreadlocks that robbed you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you recognize the one in the purple?
Now that I'm sitting there in front of him, I do.
How do you recognize him?
That night, when I was laying on the bed with my head up watching everything, it's like a bad dream.
Okay, it's after this. Okay, so there we heard Mitchell Smith basically point directly at Canada and say that's the guy as the guy who robbed him. Now that he's sitting there, he recognizes him. So on the one hand, we have some sort of definitive recognition. On the other, well, now that he's there, I recognize him. So, Vincent, what do we make about this identification of the suspects?
Well, I mean, that's not an identification to me. Now that he's here, I recognize him, right? You know, when you're being interviewed by investigators and you're looking at a six-pack, as it's called, 6 photos of individuals that have the same similar characteristics, you're expected to point out the person who was the perpetrator in this crime. So to say, well, now that I'm sitting in front of him, he looks like the guy, it's definitely the guy, to me is not an identification just based on my experience in dealing with these types of crimes.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that there are a lot of holes being poked in the prosecutor's case, not even by the defense yet, just by their own witnesses as they testify. Let's see how Mitchell Smith's testimony continued as he was cross-examined by defense attorneys.
That day or the next day, did you talk to anybody about what happened to you?
Just me, Shane, Jess, Daryl Hansford, and cops.
Okay. Says, so we posted a link about the robbery, correct?
Yep.
And said, that was me, and bro, if they didn't all look alike, they would be dead. Correct?
Yep.
Meaning, black people? Yeah. So this was the day after. And then you did a lineup about a month and a half later. Well, you looked at a lineup with Mr. Extra. Okay. And during the lineup, you picked two people.
Okay.
Felt like they looked alike.
Well, no, my exact words were that day, it's this guy, but he has this guy's nose. I don't know if he just had his nose flared up that night, like he was all angry or what, but it was this guy. But he had a big nose like this guy.
And you just went over the wall where you had written number 2 and 5 look most like the man with dreads, correct? Okay.
So in case you missed it in there, the defense attorney asked Mitchell Smith about a Facebook post he made shortly after the robbery. He posted a link to a news article about the armed robbery, and then he wrote as a comment, "This was me, bro. If they didn't all look alike, they would be dead." So, Vincent, for sure there are some very racist undertones in that post. Does it matter for the case?
Social media is the gift that keeps on giving. Even when you post something years ago, it's still there, right?
That is
People
true.
Seem to forget that, right? So not only does he say, well, they didn't all look alike, they would all be dead, then he goes into a lineup and says, well, it was this guy, but he had this guy's nose. And I've always been baffled by what that even meant. Like, how does one person look like this guy, but he has this guy's nose because maybe he was mad that night and his nose flared up? So this was a huge smack in the face in this case for the prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, he makes that comment about the nose. I don't know if his nose was flared up or what. I think for sure that will be confusing to jurors as it is confusing to us. I mean, the comment that he posted on Facebook, does that suggest to you at all? Well, he says, bro, if they didn't all look alike, they would be dead. Well, he's suggesting all black people look alike. So if that's the case, then how is he so sure about his identification?
Exactly, because those were his own words, not spoken word, but typed word from his verified Facebook account that he testified was his account, that all black people look alike. So how can you say with 100% certainty that the defendants in this case are the defendants robbed you that night at the hotel? You can't, based on your own statement.
Yeah, I mean, so far from what we have seen, there are clearly a lot of holes in the prosecution's case. Vincent's going to stick around, and when we come back, we are going to hear from another witness, this time a police officer who's going to talk about the weapon that was taken from the motel room that night. Again, a big connection prosecutors were seeking to make is that one of the guns stolen at the Quality Inn was the gun used in Jonathan Price's murder. Let's see how that plays out right after this break. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Rewind. The victim speaks. We're talking about the Marine murder trial out of Kentucky that took place this summer. And a big key in this case is whether a gun stolen from a motel room in Lexington, Kentucky was the same gun used 6 days later to shoot and kill Marine Jonathan Price. Let's hear now from Detective Timothy Upchurch from the Lexington Police Department as he is asked about this gun.
During that time, we had the homicide that involved the victim, Jonathan Price. Through that investigation, we learned that a Springfield .45 XBS was the weapon that was ultimately used in that homicide. Detectives in the unit started querying the reports that we had prior to that, to see if we had any like crimes involving a firearm such as that, and or a firearm that was stolen that would match the description of that. That's when we learned that my victims in the Quality Inn robbery had a Springfield XBS .45 caliber stolen. That we believe could possibly be involved in the homicide.
Did anything happen, I guess, initially with that information? You said they queried it and determined that the Springfield was stolen as a Quality Inn robbery. What occurred at that point?
I know that we started looking at video surveillance, and especially there was detectives looking at video surveillance in the homicide of Mr. Jonathan Price.
At some point, did there become information that Mr. Candida and Mr. Malazan may have been involved in this robbery?
Yes.
Okay.
So that was Detective Timothy Upchurch. He testified that he and fellow investigators learned that a Springfield .45 was used in the homicide. That was one of the guns stolen from the hotel room in the armed robbery 6 days earlier. Vincent, is there a definitive connection then? If it's the same kind of gun, perhaps the same serial number, which I believe we hear later on in the trial, does this mean we can definitively link the suspects?
Not quite, Stacey, and here's why. Yes, you can say it's the same caliber gun. You can say it's a Springfield .45, which there's thousands in circulation right now. You could even argue the serial number. But unless the ballistic, the striations of that bullet match from Jonathan Price's body to that gun, you can't say definitively that that was the murder weapon.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm going to skip ahead and say another witness we hear from in this case is Lauren Pilcher with the state's crime lab, and he went on to testify that a bullet recovered from Price's body, as well as a shell casing, could not be definitively matched to the suspected gun. But he also said it couldn't be ruled out. So, you know, it could be, it could not be. There's certainly a lot of question and potential doubt in that.
Yeah, there's question, but here's what's great about it in the sense that, yes, we know it was the gun stolen. We know that it could be the gun used in the homicide. So what would be the chances, theoretically, that this gun was stolen 6 days prior, just miles away from where Jonathan Price was killed, and the same type of gun was used to kill Jonathan Price?
Yeah.
So you have to take that into account as well.
Certainly some possibility. Vincent, I know you have to go. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be right back with much more. Stay with us.